This episode is presented by Silversea.
From Kurtco Media. Coming up on the show.
It's my favorite kind of food because it's almost what was left off the plate. It's what makes it so special. It's the purity of just whatever it is, you want to eat it. But it's not about gorgeous plating. It's about just great food.
That's restaurateur Danny Meyer. I'm Bruce Wallen, and this is Travel That Matters. Hey everybody, and welcome to Travel That Matters. I'm Bruce Wallen, and this is the podcast where we explore the world's most exceptional and meaningful travel experiences with some of the fascinating people that I've met over the years as a magazine editor and journalist. Today's episode marks the second in our new MasterChef season, where we're talking to culinary leaders about their travel stories, their favorite destinations, inspirations. We had Wolfgang Puck on the last episode, and we have Nancy Silverton, Charlie Palmer, and other great chefs coming up in the next few weeks here. My guest today, he's not technically a master chef, but he has certainly had a huge influence on restaurants, on food, on the way we eat today. His name is Danny Meyer, and you probably know him as the person behind everything from Union Square Café and Gramercy Tavern to Shake Shack, everybody's favorite hamburger joint. Danny, but he's not only a top restaurateur, he's also an author. He's written books including the New York Times best-selling Setting the Table. One thing you might not know about Danny, actually, is he grew up in St. Louis, and his dad ran a travel business when Danny was a kid. So he grew up they were exploring France and Italy and other places in Europe and beyond in ways that, most kids back then, most kids today for that matter, just weren't getting to experience that. And, to hear Danny tell it, those experiences turned him into who he is today. It's, he said it, like travel is everything to him, which of course I love to hear. Be sure to stick around after my interview with Danny, where I talk about a very different type of food-focused trip. Also, be sure, please, to give us a like, a comment, follow if you enjoy this episode. But for now, let's hear from world traveler and restaurateur Danny Meyer. Danny, thank you so much for joining us on Travel That Matters.
Thank you for having me.
You are very cut out for this podcast because I understand that you grew up in a very much a traveling family. Your dad ran a travel company. What was that like, and how did that shape the way your family traveled when you were growing up?
It was really everything. I mean, my parents actually spent the first 2 years of their marriage in France. And he was a counterintelligence agent in the U.S. Army. And he was stationed on the border of France and Germany, so Alsace-Lorraine. And since this was literally the 2 years after my parents were married, it turned into a protracted honeymoon. And they spent their time driving around and getting to know not only really good food, but also a lot of the innkeepers and restaurant people throughout the countryside. And he came back to St. Louis, 2 years afterwards, and started a travel agency. And the primary focus of his travel agency was to design driving tours through the French countryside. He called his company Open Road Tours. He took all these relationships that he had built with the innkeepers who took in this young American couple. And it turned out that many of them were part of an organization called Relais de Campagne. And he became the first American agent for Relais de Campagne, which, as you know, would later become Relais and Chateau. When I came along, he was pretty well into that. And he would have the sons and daughters of these innkeepers come stay and live at our house. And they would work by day in his office as translators, and at nighttime, they were kind of our babysitter. And so every single night at dinner, there would be French spoken, there would be a bottle of Beaujolais on the table, and we kids either had to figure out how to learn to speak French or or we would just not get to know what was being discussed at the table. I was getting an education in travel, food, hospitality, and I never, ever thought about it, but it turned out to be quite an education. And in fact, by the time I was 7, our family took our first trip overseas as a family. My mom made me keep a diary, and I still have it. And I was writing at the age of 7 about falling in love with quiche Lorraine and fraise des bois with creme fraiche. All these things that kids in St. Louis were not probably writing about at that point.
At a certain point, did it kind of dawn on you that you were traveling in a different way than your friends back home and kind of getting exposed to things and kind of did you appreciate that at that age?
You know, I should have in retrospect, but I'm not sure I did. We also took, what I considered normal trips. Like we'd stay in motels in Florida, and every year there was a new part of the world that we got to go see. So, I'll never forget going to New England when I was 8 or something like that, and then getting to go to California when I was 9, and getting to go to a San Francisco Giants, St. Louis Cardinals baseball game at Candlestick Park. Even if, we took a driving trip up the coast of California and stopped to get burgers at a roadside stand, that was a great education, Didn't hurt me thinking about Shake Shack many, many years later.
It's interesting because for a kid, like that experience right there, stopping and getting a burger at a stand and on the roadside in California, like that stands out as much as the Michelin-starred meal at the inn in France, right? But are there experiences from that international travel that really stand out from your early years?
I remember at the age of 7, staying in the town of Talwar on Lake Annecy. I can still to this day remember the taste of the lake water. And I remember to this day how cool it was to have a bottle of Evian water next to my bed with a little plastic cork on the top that you pulled, the little top that you took off and on. I had never seen that kind of stuff before. I can remember the first time I stayed in a hotel in Paris on that trip. I can actually remember the smell of the French baguette as I opened it up. And I can remember the taste of the butter. And I can remember the very, very bitter taste of the hot chocolate. To this day, I have to say that discovering something fresh for the first time that you've never seen, because 100% of everything I just told you were firsts for me. I had never had those experiences. Right. And, even I spent my 12th birthday in Rome, first time I'd ever been in Rome. And I remember my first lunch and the artichokes and the smell of the olive oil. And I remember the first dinner I had in Rome, which was an 8-course pasta tasting menu, as my dad was considering buying a hotel, one of the more foolhardy things he ever did. And we ate in that hotel. And I still, to this day, there's nothing I love more than traveling. And I love traveling sometimes to places I know, but even more often to places where I'm going to learn something I've never seen before, taste something I've never known existed.
How did all that growing up kind of influence the way you've traveled with your own family and your own kids over the years, from the time they were young? Did you, intentionally seek out those types of experiences for them?
I wish I could say that. I intentionally sought out experiences that would delight me in the belief that they would also enjoy them.
I think we all do that. That's a good point, yeah.
But I think that, one of the things that happens, and I give my wife Audrey lots and lots of credit, we had our daughter Hallie in Italy twice with us by the time she was 1.5. Once when she was 4.5 months old and once when she was 1.5. And I don't know that I would have had the courage to do that, except that I wanted to keep traveling. I almost constitutionally, I have to breathe Italian air at least once a year. And that's in addition to all the other places. But we weren't going to get a babysitter for her, and I wasn't going to not travel. And what's kind of cool is that of all of our kids, they all love Italy, but she has Italy coursing through her veins. She speaks it. She cooked there. She has an ice cream restaurant called Cafè Panna based on her love for Italy. So this stuff, it's pretty cool to see it find its way through osmosis and experience.
Actually, speaking of like travel back then, I believe you worked as a tour guide in Rome in college, or in the summers in college. What was that city like back then? Like, and what was that experience like, and how did that kind of inform what you ended up doing?
I was 20 years old, so it was after my sophomore year, I think. And by the way, before I was 21, my dad had gotten some crazy job as the U.S. ambassador for La Nica, the Nicaraguan airline. He became an airline employee, and he and his family, up to the age of 21, were entitled to all of the interline discounts that you could get for being part of any airline. We took a family trip to Nicaragua. It was amazing. I learned how to eat iguana eggs with salsa in them. But the cool thing for me was not so much that trip to Nicaragua. The cool thing was that I could travel anywhere that Pan Am flew for $44 round trip until I was 21 years old. I was at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and so I could get to JFK in 2.5 hours from there. So I would take long weekends, and I went to Rome, I went to Venice once, I went to Paris, I went to London, and none of my friends could believe I could afford to keep taking all these trips. But for $44, come on, you could feed 5 people at Burger King or something, and I could go to Paris. I loved when I was a tour guide. My brother, sister, and I, when we were 20, each got to pick a country in which my dad was selling tours to spend the summer working for his team in whatever that city was. And my sister had picked Copenhagen. I would pick Rome. My brother later would pick Paris to do that. And interestingly, my sister to this day speaks fluent Danish, has amazing Danish family. My brother met his wife while in France. And I'd met a whole career falling in love with Italy. So the kind of doors that get open are incredible. But I got to be a tour guide, and I was working for his team in Rome. And I learned, that's when I first started to learn how to speak Italian. And I first started to learn because I would take our tours to 1 or 2 trattorias almost every single day. And I found this was a great gig because even though his itinerary that he had sold said, and today we're going to go to a cameo factory, I didn't find that interesting. So instead I took him to restaurants. I got in a little trouble for going off script, but I was getting actually 1,000 lira kickback for every guest I would bring to these restaurants. And I found that I was so interested in making sure that whoever came on that trip was happier when they left than when I'd first picked them up at the airport. It was a great, great experience, and I learned a lot of Italian. I lived in a hotel on the top floor, which is where our guests stayed. The hotel happened to be a stone's throw from the Vatican, and it also happened to be the summer that Pope Paul died, so I went to that funeral. 6 weeks later, or maybe not even 6 weeks later, Pope John Paul I died, the new pope, so I went to that funeral. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but the following year I went to study international politics living in Rome because I wanted to go more deeply into this. Trinity College has a program there. And we were living in a convent, which is kind of an odd thing for a Jewish boy from St. Louis to be doing, but Pope John Paul II came to our convent to bless us all. So now, in the course of 1 year, I've been to 2 papal funerals, blessed by one pope, who none of us knew would later go on to be sainted. And I'm going, this is pretty cool. So I actually, years later, married a Catholic woman. Audrey and I had now been married since 1988, so it'll be 36 years this year. And I said, Audrey, I've got something I want to run by you. I think I can go down in history as the only Jew, maybe the only person, who's been to every papal funeral in his lifetime and been blessed by a pope. She said, right on. And so I said, I want to make sure that when Pope John Paul II dies, that I go to that funeral. Any good reason to go back to Rome is good for me. And she said, I'm on. That's great. So wouldn't you know, the day that John Paul II dies, Audrey's father, my father-in-law, dies, same day. And I'm kind of going, the record or the marriage? Which one do I go with here? And, to her credit, she said, my dad will never know. You may as well just go to Rome. And I said, yeah, but I'll never live it down the rest of my life. So I missed that one. And then the next pope resigned, so I didn't get to go to his funeral. I think I may get an asterisk, but if I could go to 3 papal funerals in my lifetime and be blessed by a pope, that's not so bad.
And blessed by a pope, that's pretty good. How did all your travels come into play? That clearly they influenced you to kind of go into this business in many ways, but like, what lessons did you learn from, eating from a young age in France and Italy? Like, how did you bring that to New York?
Well, I think a big part of what I learned is that I love food, I love wine, and I love sharing what I love with other people. I got some of that when I was a tour guide in Rome. I was a salesman for a few years before I got into the restaurant business, and one of my favorite parts of selling was lunch. And I would always be eating lunch by myself, and I would actually plot where I would make my sales calls based on where I wanted to have lunch, often in New York City. And this is before you could look up everything on the internet.
Yep.
So in those days, in order to find something new, you had to figure it out. You had to make relationships with people. You had to speak their language. You had to learn how to read a map properly, and find the off the beaten path kind of place. And what I found was that, at that part of my life, I was absolutely, especially in Italy, interested not in going to the restaurants that Michelin covered in Italy, not going to the restaurants necessarily that translated their menus into English or any other language, but finding places that true Italians went. And a lot of what went into Union Square Cafe, it was basically stuffing all kinds of life experiences I had had. I cooked in Italy, I cooked in France, I had taken trips to San Francisco and Berkeley and Napa and fallen in love with what was going on out there, fallen in love with the bistros of Paris. And I would say that Union Square Cafe became the restaurant that, if only it existed, would have been my favorite restaurant in the world, which was really 4 things. It was a little bit of Italian trattoria, a little bit of French bistro, a little bit of Northern California grill, bar and grill, the stuff that was happening in the 1980s, and a lot of the kind of hospitality that I felt I had grown up with in St. Louis. I didn't put St. Louis food inspiration into it. Maybe a couple of my grandmother's recipes, like mashed turnips with fried shallots, but it was St. Louis hospitality meets all these kinds of foods that I never got growing up in St. Louis, but I loved. And it was a sense, because I'd spent a lot of time dining by myself all over the world, and I saw how different places treated solo diners differently. I said, I want a place that makes everybody feel great, everybody feel like they belong. And that became Union Square Cafe. And it was a different kind of restaurant back then. I had a guy before I opened. This guy was in charge of food and beverage for the Harvard Club, and my uncle had introduced us. And he said, so tell me about this restaurant you're going to open, in a very patronizing kind of question, the way he asked it. And I told him, and he said, just so you know, it'll never fly. And I said, what do you mean? And I was scared to death hearing this kind of lion of the industry who had seen it all. He said, because when people go out to eat, they don't say, I want to go out and eat eclectic. They either want French or Italian or Chinese, but they don't say, I want to go eat eclectic. And I said, I hear you. I'm just going to give it our best shot. And they were all dishes on our opening menu that I just loved. And I didn't see why confit of duck with, potatoes fried in goose fat with garlic, or in duck fat with garlic, why couldn't that go beautifully with pasta with eggplant and ricotta salata? And why couldn't that go well with grilled marinated filet mignon of tuna marinated in soy and ginger, which I had seen in California? And I kind of put all these things together with some good wines, also from France, Italy, and California. It worked. And
apparently it did work. And look, I think also it's interesting hearing your different, influences and inspirations, because look, you've also had success from, with Shake Shack all the way up to, Michelin 3-star restaurants. How does that reflect, I'm guessing you're someone who enjoys going to get street food as much as going to, that fine dining experience. Like
Absolutely.
how is that how does that play into your travels?
What plays into my travels is that I like to eat where I am. I like to know where I am based on what I'm eating. I like to learn about people based on how they eat. When I go to any new town, I love going to food markets. I love to see how their butchers butcher meat differently than our butchers butcher meat.
I think you mentioned how you kind of sought out when you were working as a sales guy in New York. You're looking for those places on your own. You're doing the research, meeting the people. Like, do you clearly now a lot of people do rely on Yelp or however they're getting their information. Are you still trying to seek it out more from a personal? How do you go about that?
2 years of preparation before opening Blue Smoke Barbecue. We probably did 60,000 miles of travel to every barbecue capital in the country, and even some places that were not barbecue capitals, learning about the different local nuances to barbecue. And I can smell it. It's almost like my hands know when to tell the steering wheel to pull off the road. You got to go. You can feel it, see it, smell it, taste it.
Yeah, it's funny. Recently, we were in Long Beach, and I made my wife turn the car around, drive through a gas station because I had seen a Mexican restaurant with just something about the signage and the way the cars were parked in front. I was like, we have to go try that place. And so we turned around, went in there, and sure enough, it was unbelievable. And so I like to think I have that sense. You have it for barbecue. I would say I have it for Southern California.
I'll tell you what,
food.
I'm happy to play Mexican as well. Believe me, and we certainly have.
So where are some of the destinations? Like France and Italy clearly have been huge influences. Talked about Northern California. Is there another country or region or something that really has you? I mean, just you love going there to eat?
I've had amazing experiences in Japan. I've had incredible experiences in Korea. As I said earlier, Singapore, Mexico. I think about a lot, like why are so many of the things I do either connected to the three places we've mentioned, U.S., France, or Italy? Am I that boring? And I'm totally not bored, but I might be boring. And what I mean by that is I don't know that I'm qualified to express some of those cuisines. I'm definitely qualified to enjoy them. But I've had lots of people say, so why don't you guys ever do a Chinese restaurant? We did open an Indian-based restaurant called Tabla, which was open for about 13 years, much beloved by people. But that was it was happenstance. It was not part of my background. But two things occurred. One is that my longtime chef and partner from Union Square Café, Michael Romano, had fallen in love with everything Indian. And I found that I woke up one day and we had gotten this menu creep at Union Square Café where half of our menu had Indian influences. And that was great, except it didn't go with this massive wine cellar we had, French Burgundies and stuff like that. And so I said, Michael, why don't we start a restaurant just based on, because it's pretty cool. We didn't have Indian restaurants in New York that were using the green market, the Union Square Green Market, or playing, really cool music or having great wine lists. I said, what if we could kind of do a restaurant that's similar to what we do, but with Indian? And almost at that exact same moment, one of the chefs at Gramercy Tavern overheard us, and he said, you guys, you got to meet my friend Floyd Cardoz. You're describing exactly what Floyd wants to do. And Floyd was from Goa. The restaurant Tabla was fantastic, but it never would have happened if it had just been Danny Meyer. It had to happen because the right two people had this passion. And I said, let's go with it. And I love the food, but, we have an expression in our company, it takes one person with enthusiasm for any new thing we're trying to do. And we had two people with enthusiasm, so I went with it.
How you brought up that back then there weren't a lot of, Indian restaurants like that in New York. Clearly a lot has changed in that city since, it's been 40 years since you've opened Union Square Cafe. What kind of excites you about New York City from a dining perspective now, today?
Well, what excites me about New York is that every time one leaf blows off the tree, another green shoot pops up. And We saw this probably with more fervor than ever in the post-pandemic world. I've never seen more culinary innovation than in the past 2 or 3 years here. And it's it makes sense in a lot of ways. I think that COVID and the pandemic had the power to knock over the places that were either too tired or weren't really good businesses to start with. I don't think most really strong restaurants failed during COVID. It was tough. But I think if you were kind of teetering anyway, that was the push you needed. And a lot of it was that the cost structure of the pre-existing restaurants before COVID was based on a very different New York than the New York we have today. So when you sign your long-term lease, you're signing it with an understanding that this is how many people live here, this is how many people come to their office every day, this is how many people travel internationally, how many people travel on business. When all those underlying assumptions change, and yet your rent doesn't change, you got a problem on your hands. So the reason that I think there's been so much amazing innovation is that 100% of the restaurants that opened after the pandemic opened with a rent that was based on today's reality. So if you did something new, you also knew how people wanted to dine today in a very different way. So you were conceiving something and creating a financial foundation and building a team around a very new reality.
So this is a question I like to ask every chef and restaurateur. What, in your travels, what is a meal, a recent meal that just kind of stuck in your mind? You remember what you ate, you remember where you were, and it just kind of was one of those experiences that stay with you.
Last week I went to one of my favorite restaurants in the world, Joe's Stone Crab in Miami Beach. And that's happiness for me, getting great stone crabs, some fried chicken, key lime pie. Over the last many years, and pretty recently as well in London, I think the food in London is out of this world right now. There's a new restaurant called the Devonshire, which is a pub on the ground floor, like the pub of your dreams. They're expertly pulling Guinness. When I say expertly, there's always, at any given time, there's 6 kind of resting before they're ready to serve it, before they're ready to top it off. Upstairs, there is one of the restaurants of my dreams, which is very small. And you've gone through this party of the pub and you walk upstairs and it's a wood-burning fire. They're making their own coals. The chef there was apparently Heston Blumenthal's number 2 for many, many years. And the food it's my favorite kind of food because it's almost what was left off the plate. It's what makes it so special. It's the purity of just whatever it is, you want to eat it. But it's not about gorgeous plating. It's about just great food. Speaking of which, probably my favorite restaurant in the world is just outside of London in Hammersmith, the River Café, where I think Ruthie Rogers and her team do that kind of cooking, which is part of what I love in Italy is it's only on the plate if it needs to be on the plate. And it's so damn good that you're not looking for the extra flourishes. You're just looking for the flavor.
I love it. Again, showing your diversity of taste there from, crabs and on the beach in Florida to, upstairs in a pub in England, London. That was seriously enlightening. Danny, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure having you.
Oh, I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Bruce.
And now for the Wallen Wrap-Up.
A big thanks to Danny for joining us today on the show. I always like talking to people like him. I always get so hungry when they're talking about the food and the restaurants that they love and where they've eaten around the world, and then they start talking about wine, and I want a glass of wine. But I actually just got back from a very different type of food-focused trip at this place called Calavie. It's in inland San Diego, this beautiful area of kind of northern San Diego. And it's one of those places, it's on 400 acres, and it's a place where people go to get in shape, whether that's like losing a few pounds or a mental reset or whatever it is that each person needs. And I'd never done anything like this. Like I'd never been to a wellness resort before. I've never, quite honestly, it's not something I'm particularly drawn to. I kind of always figure if I've got a few days for a trip, I want to go somewhere fun. I'm going to go on an adventure of some sort. But like, I got to say, this place, it was fun, and I felt very healthier after a few days of exercising a bunch and not drinking and eating very precisely prepared food. I will say one thing I liked about Calvi was that you could kind of be as hardcore, as relaxed as you want. Like, some of these places I've heard of where you can't super strict, you can't have any caffeine or things like that. So they had me on a 2,500 calorie a day diet, which like, that doesn't sound like very little, and it's not like, but it's definitely less than what I usually take in. And then on top of that, you're doing like daily hikes and fitness classes and playing pickleball and tennis, and I even played golf. Not that that's all that active, but anyways, it was very easy to keep yourself entertained with activities that were actually good for you. And you also always, at a place like this, you meet cool people along the way. Vincent, Tina, Laura, everybody else. And a big thank you to Carol Ann as well. Now, look, will I be taking my next vacation at a wellness resort? No, I won't. But look, it's always good to get yourself out of your comfort zone and do something different. And that is, it's what travel's all about. Travel That Matters is produced and edited for Kurtco Media by AJ Mosley. Marketing by Katrin Skapertis. For more information on the destinations we talked about today, please check out our show notes or visit kurtco.com/travel that matters. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment on YouTube, or if you're listening on the podcast, please write to us at bruce@kurtco.com. That's Bruce at curtco.com.